This is all 27. All 27 Invincible variants explained. But in the episode, I could have sworn they said that there was 18. But maybe he said at least 18. I don't know. But yeah, I'm interested. I feel like this one with the cape was no. Either this one with this cape, the yellow cape, or the one with the red cape. One of them two was probably the strongest. But
Invincible comics, there are over 20 in the Invincible comics,
going into
there are
it,
over 20 different
I had
versions
thought
of Mark
like,
Grayson from across the
what the
multiverse,
hell?
and today we're explaining each one and giving them a rating out of 5. These ratings will be based on costume design,
What
strength,
is that? Hold
personality.
on. That bar at the bottom of the damn screen. Hold on. How do I get rid of that? I'll be holding on to you. I would have thought that the Mark who was wearing the Viltrumite uniform was finna be like the strongest.
Strength, personality, and most importantly, aura. Okay, so in no particular order, the first person on this list is Viltrum Invincible, who's one of the few Marks that wears the classic Viltrumite uniform. In chapter 104, it was revealed that in certain timelines, Omni-Man never allowed Mark to grow up on Earth, and instead raised him to take over the planet from day one. Viltrum Mark was clearly one of those people, and this is reflected in his above-average strength compared to most other Invincibles. For example, back in his own timeline, he killed Spawn, who's a character with infinitely more potential than the people Mark usually gets beaten up by. At some point after taking over the Earth, Viltrum Mark was approached by Angstrom Levy.
They did a wait, huh? How you just graze over that? Like that's not something crazy. They did a collab with Spawn, and he killed him after we just saw Spawn pack up Ghost Rider. Are you dead ass? What are we talking about?
Timeline, he killed Spawn, who's a character with infinitely more potential than the people Mark usually gets beaten up by. At some point after taking over the Earth, Viltrum Mark was approached by Angstrom Levy, who, as we all know, is a villain from the main dimension. Having been pummeled half to death by the main Invincible, Angstrom wanted to get revenge by hiring variants of Mark from across the multiverse to attack the main timeline. The aim of this plan was to basically ruin Invincible's reputation by having people that look exactly like him tearing apart the world. Viltrum Invincible was one of those recruits, and in exchange for their services, Angstrom promised to expand each of their empires into countless other dimensions. These alternate Marks were then sent to the main timeline in a battle known as the Invincible War. On the first day of this war, Viltrum Mark faced off against Spawn again, and we can assume he won this fight because by day 3 he was very much still alive and was seen hovering above the remains of Chicago. By this point,
why is Spawn in this verse and like they just aren't vocal about that? Why is it only in the comics? I would have liked to see that fight.
By this point, the alternate Invincibles had destroyed most major cities, including London, Tokyo, and New York, and in the process, they wiped out millions of people. That said, during the war, a bunch of alternate Marks were killed by heroes from the main timeline, meaning the 8 who survived were likely the strongest of the bunch. On day 3, Angstrom arrived on Earth pretty happy with the way things had gone, and by this stage, all he wanted was to find Mark from the main timeline. Angstrom's plan was to disfigure him so that Mark would know the same pain that he felt, but this is where things began to go wrong. After so many variants had been killed, certain Marks didn't want to keep working for Angstrom, and as a result, he sent all of them to the Wasteland Dimension. This dimension is where the main Mark got stranded in Season 2, and for these variants, they were here for a very long time. It was at least months, possibly a year or two, but at the very least it was months. According to Mohawk Mark, in the beginning, things started off okay, like it was pretty peaceful, as they just talked about what happened in their lives to turn them evil. Gradually though, when the variants began to starve, it was Sinister Mark who began the process of eating each other one by one. When it comes to Viltrum Mark, he outlasted nearly everyone and made it to the final 3, but in the end he did still get eaten. Sadly, this did terrible things for his aura, and when we do the calculations, Viltrum Mark gets an overall rating of 4 out of 5.
So there's 2 of them. There's 2 Viltrum Marks, right? The one that had the mustache got packed up by somebody. I don't even know who he lost
Moving on,
to.
we have Omnimark, who's one of the most confusing characters in the whole series. For a start, Omnimark has a costume clearly inspired by his dad, yet back in his own universe, he murdered Nolan for an unknown reason. My personal theory is that because these variant marks have empires back home, it's likely that killing Nolan would benefit him politically and allow him to take his dad's place. Let me know if you guys have any other theories down below, but regardless of the reason, the fact is Omnimark did defeat his dad, which is why it's so confusing that he was then killed by regular heroes from the main timeline. To be specific, he was strangled to death with a yo-yo, and the guy controlling this yo-yo was a hero called Madman. Madman, also known as Frank Einstein, is the main character of his own comic series, and while he does have super strength, I'm honestly not even sure if he could beat most of the Guardians of the Globe. For Madman to kill Invincible, it means that this variant must be one of the weakest, and yeah, you can maybe say that the heroes wore him down together and he was just tired, but I don't care, even a baby Viltrumite shouldn't be losing to a yo-yo. For this reason, Omnimark gets a 1 out of 5 rating.
Maybe it's like the whole verse though, like the whole verse that where he is from is weaker, not just him. So that that could be an explanation as to why he was able to kill Omni-Man.
Invincible. Up next, we have arguably the strongest Invincible, at least for this age, known as Sinister Mark. Full transparency, to me this variant has the #1 costume in the series. I mean, the black and yellow color scheme with the cape, everything just works perfectly, but even if his costume wasn't this good, Sinister Mark is still interesting for other reasons. To start with, in his reality, Invincible has a personal grudge against Angstrom Levy, and personally hunts him down, taunts him, and then squishes his son right in front of him. Sometime after that, he was then recruited for the Invincible War and faces off against a hero called Duncan Rosenblatt.
That don't make no fucking sense. That is the one who killed your son in front of you, and you recruit him to fight the only Mark that didn't do anything to you. What is that?
What's interesting here is that despite Duncan being a hero, Sinister Mark mentions how in his universe, Firebreather is a villain and one of the toughest monsters he's ever faced. In the main timeline though, he's apparently nothing special, and we can assume he lost because 2 days later, Sinister Mark was seen relaxing over one of the many destroyed cities. In terms of personality, he normally speaks like he's superior to everyone else, and was the de facto leader out of all the alternate Marks. An example of this is how when Angstrom ordered them to find Mark from the main timeline, Sinister Mark was the only one to speak up and argue that they'd already done enough. On top of that, when the variants were starving in the Wasteland dimension, he was the one who started the cannibalism, even convincing the other Marks to join him. Now, there are a couple reasons why earlier I said he was the strongest, and the first is that he single-handedly killed Viltrum Invincible. We know for a fact that he did this by himself, because at this point in time, he and Mohawk Mark were the only ones left, and Mohawk had stopped working with him. Secondly, it's clear that even Mohawk thought that Sinister Mark was the strongest, since he didn't try to fight him one-on-one and chose to fly away rather than facing him alone. He also wasn't even sure if they could beat him in a 2v1, but luckily when the main Mark did show up, they were able to win. As he dealt the finishing blow, Mohawk described Sinister Mark as the worst variant, but in this video he's the best because he gets a 5 out of 5 for costume, personality, strength, and an overall bonus star for his sinister presence. Moving on to the guy that beat him to death, Mohawk Mark is the variant who we know the most about. For context, by the time he escaped the Barren Dimension, Angstrom Levy had sort of turned to a good guy, like he'd realized the error of his ways.
That's the crazy
and he
one,
kindly
right?
opened a portal for Mohawk to go back home. However, he was understandably still pissed off about being stranded for months, and so he forces Angstrom through the portal as well. This allowed us to get a solid look into his timeline and also his weird personality. As an example, we find out that when Mohawk Mark was enlisted by his dad to take over the world, he actually thought Teen Team would help them do it. When Rex refused to help, Invincible killed everyone, including Atom Eve, although Robot did survive since his real body was hidden away. Following Eve's death, Mohawk said that it left a void that was hard to fill, and so nowadays he tries to fill it by surrounding himself with women who have the exact same look. Something else you might have noticed is that he sits on a golden throne, and this is because, like the other alternate Marks, Mohawk is the leader of the Viltrum Empire. In his reality, we see that Conquest, General Krieg, and other high-ranking Viltrumites all bow down to him, with the only exception being Thrag. If you want to avoid spoilers, then just skip ahead to the next alternate Mark on this list. But
hold on now. I think I will skip.
Following him, we have
I don't want to know too much.
5, with his personality being the standout feature. Following him, we have 2 alternate Invincibles who were both killed during the Invincible War. The first one is Sleeveless Mark, who was seen in space fighting against a hero called Tech Jacket. For context, Tech Jacket is the main character of his own comic, and to explain how powerful he is, we need to know a little bit about the Geldarians. The Geldarians are an alien race who've actually appeared in Invincible before, and their technology is some of the most advanced in the universe. However, over the years, this led to the Geldarians becoming physically weak because for generations they just used technology to do everything for them. That's why they developed these suits called Tech Jackets, which is given to every Geldarian at birth, and it increases their strength 100 times over. Now, after one of their ships crash landed on Earth, a Geldarian soldier called Kelda passed his jacket to Zach Thompson. Because humans are way stronger than Geldarians, it meant that Zach's potential in this suit was infinitely stronger than anything they'd seen before. In his fight against Invincible, Tech Jacket initially overpowered him with lasers, broke one of his goggles with a solid punch, and was just overall giving him a hard time. That being said, the Viltrumite was then joined by another Invincible with short hair, and in a 2v1, Zach had almost no chance. Both of these variants mentioned how Tech Jacket isn't a hero in their dimension.
One on the right, lean as hell.
To have killed a bunch of Geldarians,
which
may have altered the timeline in a way that meant that Zach never got the jacket. In the battle that followed, Zach realized he wasn't strong enough to win, and so he sacrificed himself by blowing up his suit. In particular, he transferred all of the Tech Jacket's power into the battery, causing it to overload, and this explosion turned both of the Invincibles to dust. Wow. Zach himself barely survived what happened, but eventually he did survive. For this pair of Invincibles, they get a combined 2 out of 5 stars, with the most interesting thing about them being how Shorthead Mark kept speaking like a classic cartoon villain. Next up, we have Parallel Mark, who helped his dad to take over the Earth in the comics and also in Season 2. Unlike many of his evil counterparts, this version wasn't willing to kill Atom Eve, but that didn't stop him from paralyzing her. This version of Eve was one of the leaders of a resistance group, and she was the one person who he actively tried not to kill. This shows that although Parallel Mark had abandoned 99.9% of his humanity, he wasn't able to go to 100% and finish the job. In fact, he'd even arranged things so that there were people waiting to take care of Eve because he was still planning on visiting her from time to time. Out of all the evil Invincibles, I feel like this one was meant to show us exactly how the main Mark would act if Omni-Man had successfully turned him in the first season. Following this, we have Robot Mark, who's a perfect clone of Invincible with Rudy's brain inside. To explain how this happened, we have to flash back to Mohawk Mark's dimension, where, like I said earlier, the main Invincible was stranded. With no way of getting home, the main Mark had to think of a plan, and so the first thing he did was rip out his hair and pretend to be Mohawk Mark. As the Emperor, he could basically do anything he wanted, and obviously his main priority was to create a portal back home. To accomplish this, he went to find a Rudy of this timeline, and in the end, they were able to.
That Rudy is still chopped, bro. What the hell is that?
The Viltrum Empire, and at first he wanted Mark to stay in this dimension and force the rest of the Viltrumites to leave. From Invincible's perspective, that just would have taken way too long, and so he hired one of the Mauler twins to build
baby
a perfect
got
clone.
hair all
the
over its body.
That Rudy's consciousness would be transferred to this clone so that he could fix the Viltrum Empire himself while Mark goes back to their main timeline. Of course, this had to be done in secret so the Viltrumites didn't know, and so they worked from a hidden location
How
for
is he
months.
old and a
the
baby
Empire
at the
had
same
no
time?
Clue where Mark was, and he specifically told them not to look for him. However, a few weeks after he said this, Conquest, Anissa, and General Krieg all showed up anyway, believing that their Emperor was a hostage. To save Mark, the Viltrumites unleashed Monster Girl, who in this reality was now a baby from using her powers too much. Interestingly, it seems like the younger she gets, the stronger her powers become, hence why in this timeline she was 1,000 times bigger than what we've seen before. In the chaos, she destroyed Rudy's secret base, but luckily the transfer was completed at the last second. After this incident, Robot Mark took charge of the Viltrumites with the intention of completely reforming the Empire. Sadly, once the original Mark escaped from this timeline, we don't actually hear or see anything more about it, but just my guess, knowing Robot, he'd probably use the Viltrumites to protect Earth until the Thrag situation is dealt with. Once Thrag and his people are no longer a threat, then yeah, it's probable he'll find a way to eradicate the Viltrumites, whether that's through a disease or some other idea he can come up with.
Confusing Thrax or Thrag, whatever his damn name is, for Conquest.
The 9th Invincible on this list is one who has a mask but without any lenses, and technically he's the one variant from the war who might still be alive. On day 2 of the battle, he single-handedly beat the Guardians of the Globe, decapitating the Immortal in the
Oh
process.
yeah, he's in the
For
Shadow
me,
Realm.
he's probably the strongest Mark that didn't make it to day 3, but like I said, there's a small chance he's still alive. The reason I say that is because instead of killing him, Darkwing forced him into the Shadowverse, which is this pocket dimension that we saw in Season 2. Invincible without lenses seemingly got trapped here forever, but it's been proven in the comic that you can survive here for a number of years. My guess is that you can probably get by killing and eating the creatures that live in this dimension, since there is pretty much nothing else you can do. Having said that, even if Invincible survived, there's only one way for him to escape, and that's if someone with access to this dimension gives him a way out. By the end of the comics, there were only 3 confirmed characters who might have this potential, and as heroes, they never give him the chance to escape, at least not on purpose. Invincible number 10 is Spider-Mark, who battled against Oliver during the Invincible War. Thanks to this variant, we know that most evil versions of Mark killed their mothers, which makes sense considering there's no chance Debbie would accept her husband and son conquering the Earth. Spider-Mark also implied that he murdered Nolan, or at the very least he tried to, which ties into my earlier theory that Omni-Man had to die in order for the Invincibles to gain their own empire. That said, Spider-Mark still clearly respects his dad, because when he was fighting against Kid Omni-Man, he told Oliver that he had to earn the symbol on his chest. Overall, his costume is one that I do genuinely like, but only for a side character. If the main Mark had this all the time, I probably wouldn't be a big fan.
Yeah, I would not
Invincible
like it.
from the GDA is up next, and this variant was, I think, the only one to ever be captured by the government. From the conversation he had with Angstrom, we know that he teamed up with Omni-Man to take over the world, but the GDA targeted Nolan with experimental bombs.
I
completely
forgot that there was a verse where Cecil was a woman, bro.
that
was a jump scare right there. But what the hell?
Is that it also destroyed most of Europe. Once his dad died, Invincible still tried to conquer what was left of the world, but the GDA tired him out and eventually caught him when he had to sleep. Since then, he's just been locked up underground, also naked, but I reckon he has a chance of escaping once the other Viltrumites learn what happened to Nolan. Flaxen Mark is Invincible number 12, and as a reminder, the Flaxens are an alien race from another dimension. In this dimension, time moves significantly faster than Earth, and as a result, characters can spend months or even years here without any time passing back home. Flaxen Mark is
Bro, that design of Omni-Man looked clean as hell. He needs to bring the beard back.
Part of the Invincible War. Based on this, we can assume that he went into the Flaxen dimension like Omni-Man, but then stayed there to take over their society. Also, because of his Viltrumite genes and because of the way time works over there, it's highly likely this is the oldest Mark Grayson, because in theory, he could have ruled the Flaxen dimension for decades and still look the exact same age as the others. Unfortunately, when he came to the main timeline, he was killed off-screen by Donald Ferguson, which in terms of embarrassment, this might even be worse than what happened to Omnimark. On that note, it's time to dive into what I call the human shields, who are all the variants of Mark that basically got no screen time during the war. In many cases, they died quick deaths, usually off screen, and were turned into Reanimen after the war. Because we know nothing about their personalities, the rating for these Marks will be purely based on their costume and just their overall look. Mustache Mark is the first one, and straight away he gets an easy 5 out of 5 stars. The main thing I love about this is that on the usual Invincible costume, you can see that he has the eye here, and this version is like a combination of that with the classic Viltrumite uniform. In my opinion, the costume is actually slightly better than Viltrum Mark, but weirdly in the show, it seems like the design has been changed slightly in a way that is way less appealing, but sticking with the comic design, that is an easy 5 out of 5. After him comes Inmate,
They should have gave him way more
who
screen
was
time.
apparently locked up in Viltrumite jail for a year. In the comic, it's heavily implied that his dad is the one who locked him up, so just from that, I'm kind of assuming that in his timeline, Nolan is probably the Emperor. Invincible's costume is nothing special, it's just what you'd expect to see in a Viltrumite jail, but despite that, he is still one of the most unique looking Marks just because of all the scars and the fact that he has the goggles on his face with no mask. Everything about this guy looks weird, but kind of in a good way, so I'm giving him a 4 out of 5. Bulletproof Mark is the 15th guy on this list, and as the name suggests, he wears the exact same outfit as Bulletproof. In Season 1, this was actually the first costume that he tried on, with art describing it as just being unsold merchandise. In Bulletproof Mark's timeline, I guess he just stuck with the design, and in the show, the colors were changed to match his blue and yellow color scheme. This version isn't too bad, I'd probably give it a 2.5 out of 5, like average, but the comic version doesn't suit him. I feel like it suits Bulletproof well, but for him, with the orange and
Looks like a
yellow,
damn
I
bug.
don't think it works. So for that reason, I'd give the original Bulletproof suit 1 out of 5. Also, in the comics, Bulletproof Mark was killed by the Reanimen, which, I mean, how weak do you have to be to get killed by them? I mean, every Viltrumite we've seen so far has dealt with them pretty easily, to be fair. So, yeah, Bulletproof Mark, I don't know how he became Emperor of whatever reality he's in, because he is not that guy. Next, we have Invincible with the massive goggles, who was heroically killed by Rex. This version was comfortably one of my least favorite in the comics, alongside Baldcat Mark, who also gets a 1 out of 5. However, one of the more eye-catching designs was the Invincible.
I like that one. That one, yeah, that one was tough.
To me gave similar vibes to, you know, when heroes like are just starting out and they make their costumes at home. It just didn't seem professional, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Anyhow, the Mark that destroyed London had a very similar costume to the main Invincible, but I'd actually say he improved it with the small alterations that he did make. This variant survived all 3 days of the war and eventually got stranded in the Barren Dimension, where he was eventually eaten, and we see his bones in chapter 103. These next two variants also got eaten by Sinister Mark, and both of them pretty much had the same costumes as Mark from the main timeline, with the biggest difference being the lack of knee pads. During the war, this version specifically targeted Atom Eve and told her that this time he wanted to enjoy killing her slowly. Compared to the other Invincibles we've seen, who either couldn't do this or kind of regretted doing it, this one might potentially be the most sadistic. Lastly, one of the final Invincibles from the war is this Mark with slightly longer hair, who we don't really see until he gets destroyed and turned into a Reanimen. Another one from the war got torn apart by this Hulk-looking guy, and when you examine the pattern and the colors of his suit, you know, it doesn't have any black for a start, you realize that this Mark doesn't appear in any other panels. Like, he genuinely just showed up to be killed, and that was it. He never shows up before, and he doesn't show up again. Now, before we end the video, there are 3 bonus Invincibles I briefly wanted to mention, and the first is Executioner Mark, who, after taking over the Earth, gave all of these civilians a true Viltrumite execution. The next Invincible comes from a timeline where Angstrom Levy was a police officer, and he tears through 2 of Angstrom's colleagues and then decapitates the third. This variant in the back of the room killed Angstrom's wife in a different timeline, and although he was never in the comics, it seems like the show has added him and tried to make him part of the Invincible War.
That nigga got his toes out? What the fuck?
He was never in the comics. It seems like the show has...
Why he got the dogs out, man?
Added him and tried to make him part of the Invincible War.
Combat advantage does that give you?
Reign, there's an apocalyptic timeline in Invincible where Angstrom kind of dresses like that, in which yet another evil version of Mark and Omni-Man have taken over the world. According to the main Angstrom, there are very few dimensions in which Mark is a good person, so it's kind of crazy to think about, but the main timeline that we follow, that is almost the real alternate reality. Most of the time, Mark is evil, and so the times when he's good, that's few and far between. It almost never happens. Anyhow,
what Invincible is this? They got a whole cloak, bro.
If you made it this far, then check out my breakdowns for Invincible Seasons 1 and 2. It should be on screen now. And subscribe so you don't miss...
It's a good video, man. It's a good video. Okay, so... yeah, the one with the cape, the one with the face mask or cloth, and then the one that was a mix of his suit with a Viltrumite suit. Those were my favorite ones as far as character design goes. But some of them definitely needed way more screen time.